here we are again to talk about the new pre-registration standards for midwives, the future midwife standards. I'm Mary Renfrew, and I was lead advisor to the NMC for these standards, and in particular, the standards of proficiency for midwives.
Hello, I'm Gwendolen Bradshaw. I chair the pre-registration programme standards reference group, and I will therefore be focusing on the new programme standards. Mary and I are pleased to have this opportunity to present the new proficiencies and programme standards, much as we did at the launch events at the beginning of this year. And we will be highlighting some of the significant changes that they are intended to bring about.
So the main purpose of the video that Gwendolen and I are going to do today is to talk about why we needed the new standards, how they were constructed, and to build on the energy and enthusiasm and positive response to the standards from the 4 UK launches that took place just at the start of 2020, with hundreds of people involved in those. We had midwife colleagues, educators, senior colleagues, and most importantly, we had women and babies and lots of students. The energy was fantastic, and the new standards were very, very warmly welcomed across the UK and indeed internationally.
Indeed, colleagues have told us that the standards have been helpful to them during these difficult and challenging times. Even before full implementation, the new standards have been used as a reference point to inform adaptations to programmes as colleagues have responded to the emergency situation resulting from the pandemic.
And so the standards have a core emphasis on a number of themes that really might help even in these difficult times. Right at the heart of the standards is an emphasis on the human rights of women and babies, on evidence-based care and staying up to date with current knowledge, and that includes changes such as the pandemic and understanding that, respectful and kind and compassionate care for all women and all babies and all families without exception, advocacy and action, not just knowing things but being able to do things, understanding and mitigating inequities, interdisciplinary working, which is so important for all women and babies, effective communication and relationship management with women and colleagues, and strength, resourcefulness and flexibility, which has been tested to its limits in the last few months as the pandemic has developed. So what are the future midwife standards? Let me just show you, if I can share my screen, what they actually look like. So here, the purple document on the left, the standards of proficiency for midwives.
And the document on the right are the new programme standards that all education institutions, together with their placement learning partners, must comply with. And they include many of the principles that Mary mentioned just a moment ago. Mary, when you set out to develop the new standards of proficiency, what was the main ambition for these new standards of proficiency?
Well, the challenge that we were set nearly 3 years ago now was to create transformative change in the quality of care for women and babies and families at this most fundamental time of their lives. Midwives have the huge privilege of being with women and babies and families throughout their maternity journey, through pregnancy, through labour, through birth. And in the early weeks of the baby's life and the transition to parenthood. And of course, there was lots of new evidence emerging and lots of new ways of seeing quality care and understanding quality care. So we needed a radical shift in education to incorporate that new knowledge and the changes in society, and to prepare all midwives to give the best possible care to women and babies and families. So why were the new programme standards needed, Gwendolen?
Well, I think for many of us, it's hard to believe that it's just over a decade ago since the previous standards were published. And there have been many pedagogical advancements in that time, including, for example, advances in technology, the use of virtual learning environments. So even from a pedagogical perspective alone, the development of the new standards for programmes was so needed to reflect the step changes that were happening around us. Also importantly, the new standards needed to be appropriate for the 4 countries of the UK, as devolution increases, there was a need to accommodate the needs of all 4 countries, and ensuring that the voices, if you like, of the 4 countries was incorporated. That added a certain richness, I think, Mary, to the discussions and dialogue, and certainly enhanced the development of the new standards. But I think it would be good to hear a little bit about the design principles maybe that guided the development. And also I think, Mary, our listeners I'm sure will be interested in hearing about the consultation and the collaboration involved over that 3-year period that you mentioned.
So right at the start, we thought very hard about what would guide us in this journey. And so we thought about some key design principles, that they would be evidence informed, that they would be outcomes based, so not focusing so much on the process of the student journey and the learning, but actually what a new midwife would be able to do at the end of that journey. Co-produced with midwives, with educators and everybody relevant that we needed. Equity and diversity absolutely embedded, including innovation, what we called future-proofed or future-focused, which was immediately tested, as we've said, by COVID, able to respond to changing circumstances. So that's been really interesting to see how that's worked. The actual development involved tremendous consultation and engagement right across the country. We did evidence reviews, we did surveys, we did face-to-face and virtual engagement and participation with thousands of people and organisations, advocacy groups, women and babies, well, not the babies, I suppose, but the women themselves having their voices into the engagement. Although we did have babies at our engagement events, we certainly did. And in fact, we had a fantastic thought leadership group. So if I can share my screen again, I'm going to show you the great, some of the great members of the thought leadership group, who met many times across the journey, and they include educators, advocates for women's own voices, midwives, and students. In fact, we had 4 student midwives at the start of the journey who became newly qualified midwives during the time. So really, really important. And we ended up with these standards being what we call co-produced or co-created as a result. So really important work to make sure they were fit for purpose. So the programme reference group was also broad, wasn't it, Gwendolen?
Yeah, yes, it was, Mary, quite broad. We obviously had representation from all 4 countries, but importantly we had a representation from heads of midwifery services, from service users, and the lead midwives for education played a significant role. I think there was something that did work well for us was the overlap with the thought leadership group that you've just mentioned there, Mary. And that meant that we could bring the work on the programme standards to the thought leadership group as they were being developed. And therefore we had a wider audience contributing to the shape and development of the programme standards. And that was really valuable. And I think it's also worth mentioning, Mary, that the thought leadership group and the programme reference group devoted considerable time to the outcomes of all that consultation that you mentioned there, including the survey findings. So there was a real depth and richness to the discussion as the standards were developed. I think at this point, Mary, it might be useful for our listeners to hear a little bit more about the key principles that underpinned the new proficiencies.
So having thought about how to construct the standards, we then thought about the content of what was going to be in the proficiencies. And we developed a number of key themes, and we were very clear about those. One was that they would be absolutely focused on the needs, the views, the preferences and the decisions of women and their babies and families, right in the middle of the page. There would be a fundamental view of human rights and equity, all women, all babies, no exceptions, regardless of their circumstances, meeting their human rights. On physical and mental health, indeed, Physical, psychological, social, cultural, and spiritual safety became embedded all the way through the standards. Advocacy for women, universal care for all women, all babies, all families, and then the additional care that some women who have complications and additional care needs also need. And that interdisciplinary working that is so important, especially for those women and babies with complications. A continuity of care and continuity of care embedded right in there. Working across the whole continuum of care and including the impact on longer term health and well-being. So being aware of the impact that midwifery has, really resonating throughout the whole of the rest of the woman's life and the baby's life, because what happens at the start puts you in the place for you to grow from into the rest of your life. And those were all reinforced in the programme standards, weren't they?
Yeah, yes, Mary, yes. I mean, I think we did devote, again, quite a bit of time to agreeing what should be included within the programme standards, because specific curriculum content and aspects of placement learning were discussed and included, and this was done in an iterative way. As the proficiencies began to emerge, the programme standards reference group were able to take on board what was being developed and begin to incorporate those within the programme standards. I do know, Mary, along the way, the Lancet series on midwifery has been pretty central, and I'm sure our listeners would be interested in hearing how that influenced the development of the proficiencies.
So just as we were getting going with the proficiencies, it was becoming clear that the Lancet series on midwifery was having a big impact globally, but also in the UK. And we turned to the framework, the Quality Maternal and Newborn Care Framework, which I'm going to share just now on my screen just to remind everybody. What happened in the Lancet series in midwifery was all the hundreds of pieces of evidence that went into demonstrating the impact of midwifery was collated, if you like, and summarised in this framework for quality maternal and newborn care. And it's really important because it talks about universal care for all childbearing women and infants and additional care for women and infants with complications. But it also includes the difference between doing practices, what we do, but also the way in which services are organised, the values one has to have when practicing, the philosophy that's important for strengthening women's own capabilities, and the way in which care providers all work together. And the evidence base underlying that and the framework itself really impacted on the shape of the standards and the formation of the domains. So yeah, it really made a big difference.
Mary, it's obvious, I think, for all to see just how extensive the role of the midwife is when you look at the Lancet series. So I'm really interested to hear how you went about capturing the complexity of the role of the midwife and covered all of that within the standards of proficiency.
Well, what we did was we developed, and let me share my screen again then, and just describe to people the 6 domains that we ended up shaping the standards around. They're interrelated, they're not separate. There's quite a lot of crossover between these 6 domains. And what I'm going to do just now very briefly is talk you through a couple of the standards in each of the domains. So I'm going to draw on my trusty document here, which of course you can all read freely on the internet. And domain 1, forming the foundation really of everything, is being an accountable, autonomous and professional midwife. And just to give you some examples, and I'm just going to read them right out of here. So 1.3 is that all midwives will understand and act to promote and enable the human rights of women and newborn infants at all times, including women's sexual and reproductive rights. So founded absolutely in that human rights and social justice perspective. And then for our very quick changing situation, like the pandemic, for example, 1.4 says demonstrate the knowledge, skills and ability to identify, critically analyse and interpret research evidence and local, national and international data and reports. That's become an absolutely critical skill for anybody working in health, and actually is in any circumstance, but especially when things are quick changing. And then 1.17, demonstrate knowledge and understanding of the range of factors affecting women, newborn infants, partners and families, and the impact these factors may have, including health and social inequalities and their determinants, historical and social developments and trends, and cultural and media influences on public and professional understanding. So understanding the roots of problems, as well as knowing what those problems are, knowing where they came from. Incredibly important to be able to respond appropriately. So nobody should be in any doubt that equity is really at the heart of these standards. We then go on to the second domain, which you've still got there on your screen, safe and effective midwifery care, which is really focused on promoting and providing continuity of care and carer. And if I give you a couple of examples there, we've got 2.3, which is demonstrate knowledge and understanding of the range of factors affecting the provision of safe and effective maternity and midwifery services and their impact on the quality of care. And 2.8, demonstrate knowledge and understanding of ways of identifying and reaching out to women who may find it difficult to access services, and of adapting care provision to meet their needs. So that requires us to be proactive and reach out and not just wait for people to come to us. And of course, then a number of different proficiencies on providing continuity of care, which is really important.
And these, as we've mentioned, Mary, have been picked up in the programme standards and reinforced.
It's fantastic. Moving on to domain 3, which is universal care. All women and newborn infants must have this standard of care. So we've avoided, and this definitely comes from the Lancet framework, we've avoided a low risk and high risk split. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is all women and infants need a certain standard of midwifery care. Women with complications need more on top of that. So in domain 3, we have, for example, the midwife's role in public health, health promotion and health protection. And that includes, for example, in 3.9, mental health and well-being, positive attachment and the transition to parenthood. In the second part of domain 3, we have the midwife's role in assessment, screening and care planning. And here in domain 3, you see a real read across, an exact read across from the Lancet framework. And this includes all the fundamental knowledge of anatomy and physiology and epigenetics, for example, as a basis for knowing and understanding the normal processes of reproduction and early life. So all of those outcomes are in there, and they're incredibly important for midwives to recognise deviations. So understanding normal is essential to recognise when things are going wrong. And there's very much an emphasis on working on partnership with the woman right all the way through here. So your assessment is done with the woman, and she's very much part of the care planning as well. So that's 3.23 is doing that care planning jointly and together.
And Mary, also in the programme standards, as in the proficiencies that focus on mental health and well-being of the woman, within the programme standards, there's an equivalent focus on well-being of students as they progress through programmes, and the responsibility that approved education institutions and practice learning partners have for that support for students.
Really, really important. And in fact, there's a real mirroring between the proficiencies and the programme standards in the focus on the woman and the baby in the proficiencies and the focus on the student in the programme standards. They're very closely allied in that way.
Exactly.
So moving on to the third part of domain 3, and this is the midwife's role in optimising normal physiological processes and working to promote positive outcomes and prevent complications. Incredibly important to be able to do that. And so 3.24 is identifying how factors in the care environment can impact on normal physiological processes, and how the midwife can work to promote and protect a positive environment, both physical and emotional. And a very simple example of that is making sure people don't just walk in and out the door of a labour ward when the woman is in labour, for example, or making sure the lighting isn't harsh. You know, there's a number of things in the environment that actually directly affect the woman's physiology, so she feels safe at all times. So that's domain 3, universal midwifery care. There's lots more to it. Please do go and read it. And then we move on to domain 4, which is the additional care that women and newborn infants with complications need. Those may be clinical, physical complications, or they may be social, psychological, cultural additional care needs, for example. And so we have 4.2 in the first line management of complications, identifying and using reports and data on local, national and international prevalence and risk to develop knowledge and awareness of complications and additional care needs that may affect women, newborn infants and families. Again, referring back to this very fast changing situation, but it's important always. And in 4.8, this is talking about actually how you act, not just what you know, but how you act. Use evidence-based best practice approaches for the first line management of complications and additional care needs for the woman, for the fetus, for the newborn infant. And that includes support, referral, interdisciplinary and multi-agency team working, escalation and follow-up. So knowing how to do those things is embedded right into this domain. And then in the second part of this domain, the additional needs one, is knowing how to work very closely with the interdisciplinary team when you need other services. And so in 4.9, for example, we have demonstrate the ability to work in collaboration with the interdisciplinary and multi-agency teams while continuing to provide midwifery care needed by women and newborn infants. So working in collaboration while continuing to provide midwifery care, really critically important skill. Moving through to domain 5, which is really very new. A lot of these standards are very new, but this whole domain is completely new. The midwife as colleague, scholar, and leader. And the first part of this is about working with others, the midwife as colleague, working not only with individual colleagues, but working as part of a whole system. And that's very much about promoting safety, knowing how to act when there are systemic issues to deal with. And so looking, for example, at 5.13, demonstrate the ability to develop strength, resourcefulness and flexibility to work in stressful and difficult situations, and to develop strategies to contribute to safe and effective practice. And then there's a list of things, including reflection, communication, collaboration, advocacy, strength-based approaches, and responding to unpredictable situations. It's asking a lot of our students and our newly qualified midwives.
It is, Mary, but I think that's one of the reasons why it was agreed that, you know, the award, the academic award being given to students who successfully complete the programs would be pitched at graduate level, because to function as a midwife, certainly students need to call on graduate level attributes, skills and knowledge.
And then the second part of domain 5 is developing knowledge, positive role modelling and leadership, the midwife as scholar and leader. And there's a lot in here about understanding research. Actually, there's quite a lot through the whole document about understanding evidence, using evidence and understanding research, and evidence-based improvement, support and supervision for students, and understanding positive leadership and role modelling. So that's all there. Moving on to the domain 6, which is the skills that underpin all of these other domains. And we were a bit reluctant at first to pull these out separately. We wanted the skills embedded into all of the domains, but it got a bit messy. So we've pulled them out into a separate domain, but critically important, they must underpin the other domains and be very, very closely allied to them. So there's a little diagram about how to understand how to do that and where to do that. So there's a lot of skills. I'm not going to go through all of them at all. But it's more than knowledge and understanding. It's also action, knowing how to act. So for example, 6.27, recognise and respond to signs of all forms of abuse and exploitation and the need for safeguarding. So it's responding, it's not just seeing it, it's knowing what to do. And indeed, being able to act as an advocate, which is also incredibly important to keep women safe. 6.45, act as an advocate when care involves the interdisciplinary and multi-agency team to ensure that care continues to focus on women and babies, and that in the process of things getting complicated, things don't get taken away from the importance of the woman at the centre of all of this. So then the skills go on to communication, relationship management, medicines administration, and so on, all there. So all the things that all students must meet the level before they become midwives, the expectation, the benchmark, if you like, for midwifery in the UK for everyone. So the programme standards, Gwendolen, they're designed to enable students to achieve these proficiencies. So let's hear about these now.
Thank you, Mary. Yes, I mean, I'd like to begin with highlighting two key features of the new programme standards. I think firstly, as you would expect, their focus on students. So the student experience and the student voice is absolutely central within the new programme standards. Indeed, the need for individualised, tailored learning experiences, they're absolutely highlighted. And I believe there is a new emphasis on valuing and supporting students, including, as I've previously said, their well-being throughout the programme. So these are very evident now and very explicit within the new programme standards. However, as we've already mentioned, that strong read across to the proficiencies, the new programme standards also place a core focus on women and newborn infants. A number of roles, Mary, I mentioned in the new standards framework. And I'd like to mention the role of the lead midwife for education. I did allude to that role earlier, but I'd just like to say a little about the role. Obviously, the lead midwife for education is responsible for midwifery education in their respective institution. And we have included details about this role, and they are set out within the programme standards. It's an important role, and we felt it was important to make sure there was clarity in relation to this role within the programme standards.
Really important. So we talked earlier about the design principles that underpin the proficiencies. I mean, what design principles did you have in developing the new programme standards?
Ah, well, that's an interesting one. I mean, some of them were more challenging than others. I think an important one is the fact that the new standards are now outcome focused and measurable. There's a move away from an emphasis on inputs and processes. And you've already highlighted that, Mary, in relation to the proficiencies. It's not about knowing how to do things, it's actually being able to take action and make a difference. This new emphasis on outcomes is giving education institutions alongside their practice learning partners more flexibility and autonomy in terms of how they design programs. The need for the programme standards to be future-proofed and agile, I think this is a challenge to everybody. But that was one I feel that we rose to, and we also did include the concept of continuous improvement. And together they're intended to ensure that education institutions can be responsive to changing circumstances and ensure that their programmes remain contemporary in what is an ever-changing world. I think a final feature I'd like to just point out is the fact that they were written and presented in a format that was intended to be accessible to the public, to a range of stakeholders. So somebody could pick up the documents and read them and understand what we were intending to achieve.
So lots of changes, but that's not all. There's other changes, aren't there, as well as putting students at the heart. And
yeah, I mean, I think that putting students at the heart is really important, particularly in the programme standards, as they are essentially intended to support students in achieving all of the proficiencies. So there is a new emphasis on student empowerment and students' active participation in their programmes. So that they're not passive recipients of curricula. They're actually working alongside academics and practitioners in continuing to give feedback on their programmes and contributing to that continuous improvement agenda. But
much mirroring the way we're seeing the relationship with women and babies.
Absolutely. It feels like two sides of the one coin here. I think also the scope of the standards is much wider. There's a lot more detail, and I think that's going to provide colleagues with greater clarity. And they have been published in 3 parts this time, Mary. We've moved away from that one document for midwifery. There are now 3 parts to the new education standards framework, and that is important to point out.
And yes, I guess colleagues need to understand that for parts 1 and 2 were published in 2018.
Yeah.
And maybe if we just have a look at them for a moment so everybody can understand what we're talking about. Maybe you just want to talk us through these.
Yeah, thank you, Mary. I think it will be helpful just to briefly touch on parts 1 and 2, because these standards concern things like the overall learning culture, education governance and quality, and importantly, safe and effective practice learning environments, including standards relating to the supervision of students and the assessment of students. But the standards also include the upholding of the NMC Code of Practice, and for that reason you can see the Code of Practice there in the slide. So we got parts 1 and 2 together with the code to take on board, in addition to the pre-registration midwifery standards, which is part 3. And these are really the standards that are very specific to and essential for midwifery education.
And it's really part 3 we're talking about today, isn't it?
Yes.
1 and 2 are there and form the foundation. 3 are very midwifery specific.
Absolutely. And I think the standards are making it very clear that the overall responsibility and accountability for compliance with the standards, and indeed the management of the quality of the day-to-day delivery of pre-registration midwifery programs lies with the approved education institutions, importantly in partnership with their practice learning partners, and this has been made very explicit. But the pre-registration midwifery program standards follow the student journey. They take us through right from the point of selection and admission of a student onto a program through to successful completion and the academic award. And I've mentioned earlier, this is at graduate level. So the real essence of part 3, the pre-registration midwifery program standards, is in relation to curriculum content and practice learning requirements that are very specific and essential to students achieving all of those proficiencies that Mary has covered for us. So that clear read across, Mary, between the program standards and the proficiencies, absolutely essential to the way forward.
Brilliant. So the new proficiencies
and
the program standards pave the way really for a very ambitious, innovative and creative set of programs designed to equip the midwives of the future to practice really across the next 10 years. That is the plan. So I'm going to stop sharing for a minute. We don't need that up there anymore. And just to say thank you to everybody. It's been such a journey for us, and working very closely with the NMC team, who have been fantastic, and hugely with a lot of people out and across the 4 countries of the UK to really co-create these new transformative standards. The huge generosity of everybody involved in giving their time and their expertise, their knowledge. And it's now over to you out there across the country, in universities, in practice sites, new students, everybody working together to develop curricula, the best possible theory and practice experience, to really transform these transformative standards into real change, genuine change, with effective partnership working between universities, practice settings, students, and women and families themselves. So I just want to say a huge thanks to all of you, and good luck in the implementation of these standards. And we really look forward to seeing the outcomes.
And I think it just remains for Mary and I to say a special thanks to you for listening today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.